It was August 26, 1969, Las Vegas, Nevada. The International Hotel stood like a glittering fortress in the desert, its neon crown reflecting off the chrome of 1,000 Cadillacs parked outside. Inside, the city's elite gathered shoulder to shoulder, gamblers, movie stars, soldiers home from Vietnam, and couples celebrating anniversaries they'd barely survived. The air smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke, thick with the promise of something unforgettable, because that night, Elvis Presley was back. Backstage, the king sat quietly in front of his dressing room mirror. The bright bulbs made halos in his dark hair. He looked older than the boy who had once shaken America awake with a guitar and a grin. Years of touring, fame, and heartbreak had softened the sharpness of his jawline. But when he smiled, when those blue eyes flickered toward his reflection, the room seemed to glow again. His red scarf was tied loose around his neck. He adjusted it, exhaled, and whispered under his breath, "All right, let's do this." The band was ready. The sweet inspirations had finished their prayer. The curtains trembled as the crowd's roar built like a storm outside. Then came the moment. Strauss's also sprach. Zarathustra thundered through the speakers. The audience leapt to their feet. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks, and then he appeared, Elvis Presley, tall, radiant, dressed in white and gold, stepping into the light as though heaven itself had opened a door for him. The applause hit like a tidal wave. He smiled, raised his arms, and the band melted seamlessly into "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" The opening chords rippled through the hall, soft and nostalgic. Lovers in the audience clasped hands. Even the waiters paused to listen. Elvis closed his eyes and let his voice fall like velvet over the crowd. For the first minute it was magic, perfect, effortless, divine. And then something happened. Behind him, one of his backup singers, Cissy Houston, caught his eye. Maybe it was the way she tilted her head, or the playful sparkle in her look. No one's quite sure. But whatever it was, it cracked something open in him. Elvis's lips twitched. He tried to hold steady, but a smile crept across his face. He looked away, too late. The laughter hit him like a wave. It was August 26, 1969, Las Vegas, Nevada. The International Hotel stood like a glittering fortress in the desert, its neon crown reflecting off the chrome of 1,000 Cadillacs parked outside. Inside, the city's elite gathered shoulder to shoulder. Gamblers, movie stars, soldiers home from Vietnam, and couples celebrating anniversaries they'd barely survived. The air smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke, thick with the promise of something unforgettable, because that night, Elvis Presley was back. Backstage, the king sat quietly in front of his dressing room mirror. The bright bulbs made halos in his dark hair. He looked older than the boy who had once shaken America awake with a guitar and a grin. Years of touring, fame, and heartbreak had softened the sharpness of his jawline. But when he smiled, when those blue eyes flickered toward his reflection, the room seemed to glow again. His red scarf was tied loose around his neck. He adjusted it, exhaled, and whispered under his breath, "All right, let's do this." The band was ready. The sweet inspirations had finished their prayer. The curtains trembled as the crowd's roar built like a storm outside. Then came the moment. Strauss's Also Sprach Zarathustra thundered through the speakers. The audience leapt to their feet. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks, and then he appeared, Elvis Presley, tall, radiant, dressed in white and gold, stepping into the light as though heaven itself had opened a door for him. The applause hit like a tidal wave. He smiled, raised his arms, and the band melted seamlessly into Are You Lonesome Tonight? The opening chords rippled through the hall, soft and nostalgic. Lovers in the audience clasped hands. Even the Colosseum was packed, every seat taken, the aisles overflowing with fans clutching roses, cameras, and trembling hands. Outside, rain fell in thin silver lines against the parking lot, but inside the air was fever-hot, the kind of electricity that only Elvis could summon. The tour had been long, the schedule brutal, yet that night, the king walked on stage like a man with something heavy on his heart. He wore a white jumpsuit, studded with sapphire stones that shimmered under the stage lights. As the brass section blared the opening fanfare, he smiled at the crowd, but it was a different smile, smaller, almost forced. To most, it looked like confidence, but to those close enough to see his eyes, there was something else there. Exhaustion, grief, and a strange, quiet sadness that seemed to follow him everywhere by then. The band launched into C.C. Rider, and the audience roared, shaking the rafters. Elvis moved across the stage, swinging his cape, his voice filling every corner of the hall. But in between songs, when the applause faded, there were moments, tiny, fleeting, when he seemed lost. He would stare into the crowd like he was looking for someone who wasn't there. Nobody knew it yet, but the pressures were eating him alive. The constant touring, the loneliness, the divorce that had hollowed out his home life, all of it was taking its toll. That night it showed. Halfway through the concert, the lights softened, and the orchestra began the opening chords of "You Gave Me a Mountain." It was one of his most emotional songs, a story about struggle, loss, and faith. Elvis took a deep breath, stepped closer to the microphone, and began to sing, Born in the Heat of the Desert. His voice trembled slightly, not from weakness but from something deep. 20,000 people holding their breath as the king of rock and roll fought back tears on stage. He tried to continue. His voice wavered, softer now, more fragile. And then something remarkable happened. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't shout. They began to sway. A few people closed their eyes. Others whispered, "We love you, Elvis." It was no longer a concert. It was a confession. By the time he reached the last chorus, his voice was breaking completely. He pulled the microphone close, pressing it against his lips, and whispered the final line, "You gave me a mountain this time." When the last note faded, there was no applause, just stillness. Then slowly, like a rising tide, the sound of clapping began, soft at first, then louder, until it became a storm of love. Elvis lowered his head. He couldn't look up. He mouthed the words "thank you," barely audible, and turned away for a moment, his shoulders trembling. In the footage from that night you can see it, that moment when the mask slips. For years Elvis had been untouchable, immortal, more myth than man. But on that stage in Hampton Road, the Hilton showroom glowed in gold and smoke. Night after night, Elvis Presley stepped into that same light, sang the same songs, greeted the same sea of faces. And yet, something had changed. The man who once laughed uncontrollably on stage now barely smiled. The laughter was gone. In its place lived a quiet kind of fatigue, a sadness that even rhinestones couldn't disguise. He stood behind the curtain, cape draped over his shoulders, head bowed. From the audience came the familiar chant, "Elvis, Elvis, Elvis." But his eyes looked empty, distant. The band tuned their instruments, unaware that behind them the king was waging a private war no one could see. The music began, and the crowd roared as he walked into the light. He looked magnificent, yes, the white jumpsuit, the glittering belt, the slick dark hair, but up close his hands trembled. He gripped the microphone like a lifeline. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he said softly. "Hope you're doing all right tonight." His voice carried that honey-drenched southern warmth, but it was thinner now, stretched over exhaustion. The show opened strong. C.C. Rider, "I Got a Woman, Love Me." The fans screamed, the lights flashed, the band played flawlessly. But mid-set, something cracked. It happened slowly, like a record skipping on an old turntable. His words started to slur slightly. The timing slipped. The band glanced at each other. The sweet inspirations watched him carefully, sensing something was wrong. Elvis turned toward his lead guitarist, James Burton, and gave a weak grin. "You ever feel like the room's spinning?" he muttered into the mic. The audience laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. A few moments later, he stumbled. Not dramatically, not enough to cause panic, just a half step, a blink too long. The music hesitated. He caught himself, forced a smile, and pushed on. But the crowd could feel it, a strange stillness creeping into the show. When he reached, "You've lost that lovin' feelin'," his voice faltered completely. He stopped mid-line, staring out into the lights. The band froze. Nobody moved. For a full 10 seconds, the king said nothing. 10 seconds of silence in front of 3,000 people. Then quietly he said, "You know, sometimes I forget where I am." A nervous laugh rippled through the room, but he didn't smile back. He just stared into the dark, breathing heavily, sweat shining on his temples. The band waited. So did the crowd. Finally, he shook his head, whispered, "Let's start that one again," and forced the band to restart. The show went on, but the magic was gone. His energy flickered like a dying bulb, bright one second, dim the next. Between songs, he rambled about nothing: karate, sandwiches, the weather. People laughed politely, unsure whether to cheer or worry. By the end of the concert, Elvis looked drained, pale, almost translucent under the lights. He bowed, blew a kiss to the crowd, and walked off stage before the final applause had even finished. The audience clapped and whistled, but there was confusion in the air, an unspoken sense that something had broken, something bigger than a missed note. Backstage, he collapsed into a chair. The cape slipped off his shoulders. He reached for a glass of water, but his hands were shaking. "Man," he whispered, "I can't do this much longer." One of his friends tried to lighten the mood. "You kidding, E? The crowd loved you." But Elvis just smiled faintly. "Oh yeah," he said. "They always do." That's the problem. For the next few minutes, nobody spoke. The sound of distant applause filtered through the walls, fading into quiet. Elvis stared at the floor, breathing hard. The laughter that once echoed through those halls was gone now, replaced by silence, heavy and absolute. That night, the world didn't see the breakdown. The cameras were turned off, the microphones muted. But those who were there say they felt it, a moment when the king wasn't performing anymore. He was just standing in the wreckage of everything he'd built, trying to remember why it used to feel like joy. In later years, people would talk about that concert as a rush. The Market Square Arena pulsed with excitement as 20,000 people filled the seats, unaware that they were about to witness history. Not the triumphant kind, but something far more fragile. Elvis Presley, the man who had once set the world on fire, was about to step on stage for the very last time. Backstage, the king sat quietly, hunched in a folding chair. His white jumpsuit, the Mexican sundial they called it, shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights. But it wasn't the same radiant figure of years before. He was heavier now, pale, his eyes tired. A doctor stood nearby just in case. The air was heavy with the smell of hairspray, sweat, and silence. Someone from his entourage leaned down. "E, the crowd's ready." Elvis nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "All right, let's go." The lights dimmed. The familiar opening, also Sprach Zarathustra, rolled through the speakers like thunder. The crowd roared to its feet, the sound shaking the rafters. For a moment, everything felt like it used to. The king was back. He walked out, cape flowing, diamonds glinting, microphone in hand. He smiled faintly, waved, and began to sing. The first song was C.C. Rider. His voice still had that warmth, that velvet undertone. When the final song began, Can't Help Falling in Love, the crowd rose to its feet. They swayed, they sang along, they reached for him like pilgrims reaching for a miracle. Elvis lifted the mic for the last verse, his voice low, trembling but sincere. "Take my hand, take my whole life too." And then came the last line, "For I can't help falling in love with you." The music faded. Elvis lowered his head, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you. God bless you." He turned, walked off the stage, and disappeared into the darkness. The lights dimmed, but the sound of the audience lingered. Cheers, sobs, applause that seemed to go on forever. Nobody knew it, but the king would never perform again. 6 weeks later, he would be gone. Those who were there that night still remember it not as a concert, but as a farewell. There was no announcement, no curtain speech, just the quiet understanding that something sacred had ended. In that final bow, in that last trembling note, Elvis Presley gave the world everything he had left, and when he walked away, it wasn't in defeat, it was in peace, because for Elvis, the stage was never just a place to sing. It was where he lived, where he broke, where he loved, and finally, where he said goodbye. Memphis lay under a thick summer haze, the kind that made the air shimmer above the rooftops. Inside Graceland, the mansion that had once been full of laughter and music was now heavy with silence. The curtains were drawn. The gates outside were lined with fans who didn't yet know why they had gathered, only that something felt wrong. At 2:33 p.m., the news broke. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, is dead. The words spread like a shockwave across the world, from radio stations in America to tiny transistor radios in distant countries. Within an hour, phones jammed, airports filled, and television anchors struggled to speak through the breaking coverage. In Las Vegas, Where he had performed hundreds of shows, hotel marquees dimmed their neon lights. In New York, record stores played Can't Help Falling in Love on repeat. Across the ocean, fans in London and Tokyo lit candles in the streets, everywhere. People cried. Even those who weren't fans felt the strange weight of it, the feeling that an entire era had ended. Back in Memphis, at Graceland's gates, the crowd had swelled to thousands. Some clutched flowers, others brought records or old concert tickets. A woman in tears whispered, "He gave us so much, and we never really knew him." The air smelled of lilies and candle wax. Inside, those closest to him were numb. His father, Vernon Presley, sat in a chair by the front window, staring at the endless line of people outside. He loved them, he said quietly. They were the only thing that kept him going. On the radio in the next room, the DJ spoke in a trembling voice. Elvis Presley has left the building. Forever. Across the world, televisions replayed his final performance, Indianapolis. June 26th. Viewers watched the same smile, the same bow, the same whispered thank you. But now, knowing it was his last, every gesture felt different, heavier, final, sacred. In one grainy clip as the curtain fell, a faint echo of applause bled into silence. That sound, applause fading into nothing, became the world's lullaby that night. Airports were flooded with fans flying to Memphis. The funeral was set for August 18th, and by dawn more than 80,000 people lined Elvis Presley Boulevard. They sang his song softly like prayers. "Love Me," tender, drifted through the crowd, blending with sobs and the hum of helicopters overhead. Some had come from across the country, some from across the ocean, all for the same reason, to say goodbye to the man who had never really left them. When the procession began, the white hearse moved slowly down the street, sunlight glinting off its polished surface. The car was followed by limousines filled with family and friends. The sound of crying rose like waves. One fan shouted, "We'll never forget you." And in that moment, the entire crowd answered. Thousands of voices, one heartbeat. "We love you, Elvis." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city of Memphis fell quiet. Radios played If I Can Dream. Candles flickered in windows. And for the first time in decades, there was no Elvis song being performed anywhere in the world. Just silence, the kind of silence that only follows greatness. The man was gone, but the echo remained. In every diner jukebox, in every neon-lit bar, in every aging heart that once beat faster to his music. Elvis Presley had left the building. Yes, but his sound, his soul, his laugh, his heartbreak, and they stayed. Even now, decades later, people still make the pilgrimage to that white-columned house in Memphis. They walk past the gates, read the words Elvis Presley, 1935 to 1977, and they whisper, "Thank you," because somehow the king never really died. He became what he always sang about, a dream that couldn't fade, a love that couldn't help but stay. And somewhere, maybe, the music still plays faintly, softly, an eternal echo after the king,